We all have things that we're worried about. And the reality is that there's a lot out there in the world to be afraid of. In addition to the everyday problems that we're all dealing with, there are all kinds of terrifying things in the big picture. Distant wars, a global pandemic, that make it really easy to feel small and vulnerable. Now, I'm an anxiety-prone person myself. And over time, I've found that there is one really simple intervention that's made a huge difference for me when it comes to dealing with my anxiety, and I think it'll make a big difference for you too. It's really easy, it takes just a minute or two, but if you apply it consistently, it can really help us see our fears so much more clearly and deal with those fears much more effectively. And my secret weapon is right here. Well, it's over here. It's a notebook and a pencil. Or, I'm a pen person, but if you're a pencil person, that's great too. You could also just use a Word doc on your computer, but I find it a bit more natural if I just write it down physically. Pretty equal opportunity here. But the basic idea is that the next time that you have something you're afraid about, something that's causing you anxiety, here's what you do. First, you write a brief summary of what you're afraid of. I find it really helpful to write in as simple language as possible. Particularly, I try to use a lot of I statements and avoid over-explaining why I feel the way I feel. And this can be used for everyday sources of anxiety and also for the fears that are a little more irrational or extreme. So here are a few examples. I'm anxious about my relationship with Fred. I'm worried that the next time I see him, he's going to make things really awkward. I'm worried that the next time I go out in public, I'm going to get sick. I'm afraid that someone is going to break into my house in the middle of the night and hurt me. So you've written down the summary. Then I date it. That's also very important. And if we only do that, if we stop there, this practice itself is already really helpful, because if you keep a journal like this for a long enough period of time, you start to develop a log of all of the stuff you were afraid of, most of which never ends up happening. Because the truth is that most people are really bad at threat assessment. And it's not your fault. We fixate on the dangers of extremely unlikely events while minimizing the consequences of much more boring things, like the long-term health consequences of being stapled to our desks every day, speaking from personal experience. And we have this broader cultural obsession with plastering every screen with sensationalistic terror. But a lot of our problems here come back to the nature of our brains themselves. Fear and the emotions that are sources of fear, like shame, are heavily prioritized by the brain because they are closely tied to survival. And this is the negativity bias in a nutshell. If you don't feel good today, you might have an opportunity to feel good tomorrow. But if you don't pay attention to your fear today, you might never feel anything again. From an evolutionary perspective, from the stance of your body's desire to just pass on more gene copies, what are the consequences of worry? Some unnecessary anxiety, maybe lower quality of life. What are the consequences of not enough fear? Well, game over. These days, the truth is that most of the things that cause us anxiety are not life or death situations. But we're carrying around fear machinery in the brain that's very similar to what our ancient ancestors had inside of their brains when things were much higher state. So sure, Todd from accounting coming at you in the company all hands isn't actually as threatening as that time when your many times great-grandmother or whatever was almost exiled from their hunter-gatherer band. But your brain interprets the situations similarly. And here's where that journal comes in. We can look back through it and have an honest accounting of all the things that we were worried about, most of which don't happen. If they do, it's usually not as bad as we thought it would be. And so this is a really powerful practice for just getting some separation from the fear machinery of the brain. Being able to take a little step back and realize that the story that your mind is telling you about something is not always reliable. We're unreliable narrators inside of our own minds. We get taken in by the stories people tell us, and we're very susceptible to influence from outside sources, many of which are really benefited by keeping us afraid. And if you do this over a long enough period of time, two things happen. First, when an anxious thought or a worry or a fear appears inside of your mind, you start to view it a bit more skeptically. You're not as taken in by it. You have a little bit more separation from it. And there's this part of you that chimes in and goes, wait a second, do I really need to be afraid of this? And then second, you get a lot better at appraising the likelihood of things. You start to see patterns inside of the fears that did happen versus the ones that didn't happen. And what you find is that the ones that end up happening are often the ones that you were actually the least worried about. And they're the ones that have the lowest consequences to you if they did happen. All right, so that's already a good and useful practice. Write down in very simple terms the thing that you're concerned about, date it, and keep a running log. Then look back over that log from time to time and reflect on some of the patterns that you see there. But if you want to take this practice to the next level, you can ask yourself these 3 questions and write down the answers. First, how likely is this to happen? So put a percentage guess next to whatever you wrote down. Second, how bad would it be if it did happen? And you can do different things for this. Maybe you'll write out a couple of words. For me, because it's how my brain works, I like to put a 0 to 10 scale next to it. 0, it wouldn't be a problem at all. 10, it would be absolutely catastrophic. And then there's an optional third question. If it happened, what would I do? And this could include your plan for how you would respond to it. Maybe it would include writing down some of the resources that you would draw on if the bad thing happened, or anything else you want to write that you would find helpful. As a quick note here, I generally only do the third step for what I'll call the everyday fears. These are fears that I assess as having a somewhat realistic chance of happening. I tend not to do this for more catastrophic fears because it can actually create a kind of spiral. Those are the things that are so scary and so big. And often they're so scary and so big because there's realistically very little we can do about them. But that fear is balanced by the knowledge that they aren't particularly likely most of the time. Writing down the answers to those questions allows us to get even more specific about our guesses, our estimations, and our appraisals of the future. It also helps us get more insight into how our unique minds work. You can start to see patterns and start to see the pattern in how likely you appraise different things of happening and how bad you think they'll be if they do happen. For example, if you're somebody who appraises their fears as very likely, and then they consistently don't happen, that suggests that your appraisals just aren't that accurate, and you're the kind of person who tends to overestimate whether or not something scary will happen. And then in the future, when a fear rises in your mind, you can approach it from that stance by incorporating that evidence, that increased self-awareness. And this is definitely not a magic bullet to just never being afraid of anything ever again. I wish I could figure that one out, but it does help us start to act more rationally around our fears. Or maybe you're the kind of person where everything feels like it's a 6 or higher on the 10-point scale. And if that's the case, then you're probably somebody who tends to catastrophize, and you're overestimating just how bad things would be if they happen to you. Or maybe you're somebody who has a lot of very intense, even pathological fears. And these are things that it might make sense to work through with a clinician if you have access to a therapist. But that third question, what would you do, is so important to this whole exercise because action binds anxiety. We fear the things that we feel that we have no influence over. And going back to the beginning, there are so many things in life that we don't have a lot of influence over, and maybe all we can do to lower our anxiety related to them is get more realistic about the odds of them actually happening. But for everyday fears, the ones that are actually fairly likely to happen to us, it's really helpful to be able to tap into a feeling of agency related to them. What would you do if they happened? What are some of the resources that you could draw on? How could you take some preventative steps these days to make it less bad if it did happen? And as you do this, as you have the feeling of being able to actually influence your environment in a meaningful and useful way, we call this self-efficacy, this can help you feel better about the world that you're living in. And as you feel better, it's really important to take a moment to notice that win, experience that success, feel like it's sinking into you even. And if that process makes you feel a little squeamish, as it made me feel a little squeamish for a very long time, then maybe that's actually an indication that it's something that would really benefit you. And hey, it's also possible that as you go through this process, what you discover is that you're actually really accurate and very rational about your appraisals of the world and threat assessment in general. You don't overestimate how likely things are to happen, and you're very accurate about how bad things would be if they did happen, and you really understand your resources and your vulnerabilities. If so, awesome. Or maybe you have unique life circumstances where you're living in a situation where it is totally rational to be on high alert all the time. You are in a truly dangerous environment, you have extremely limited resources, and because of that, it makes a lot of sense for you to be extremely threat averse and very attuned to fear. Maybe even you go through this process and you discover, wait a second, I'm actually underestimating the threats out there. All this stuff that I thought was not particularly likely keeps on happening to me, and I actually have to bump up my appraisal of the risk of these different things. That's going to describe some of the people who watch this. And if that's what you end up discovering, awesome. Our goal here is to see the world more clearly, get some space around our biases, and learn what we need to learn. But most of the people I talk to are more likely to overestimate threats than underestimate them. In large part, just because that's how our brain works. And when they go through this process, what they typically find is that the things that they're afraid of are less likely of happening than they thought. If they did happen, they wouldn't be the end of the world, and there are real things that they would be able to do to make them even more manageable. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I'd like to hear from you down below in the comments what you think of this practice, if you give it a try yourself. And also just to say at the end, I'm sure that this is not a purely original idea. It's just something that I started doing that was helpful for me. And it has some similarity to techniques that are used in therapeutic approaches, like particularly cognitive behavioral therapy. But I'm not a therapist, so I would refer out to people who know a lot more about this than I do. If you made it all the way to the end here, I'd really appreciate it if you took a moment to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.